Welcome, everyone, to selfprinciple.org, where sleep, exercise, love, and food are really the key ingredients for a healthy, happy lifestyle. So, today I wanted to talk about fasting. As you guys know, there are so many videos, podcasts talking about fasting, but the real question is a lot of them are one sided. So, let's talk about what are the pros, what are the cons. And before we get into it, I want you to know that I also practice intermittent fasting. So, this is not just coming from experience, but this is really to look at what is the evidence behind it and what are the risks behind it and what you should know about it. So we're going to look at an even view on this and look at both the positives and the negatives so you get to decide for yourself, is this something you ought to be looking at? With that, let's talk about the types of fasting. Now, there's a couple of big categories. The first category is, of course, the intermittent fasting. Now, that can be broken up into a few varieties, such as alternate days. So you fast on one day, eat regularly the next day. There's the 5 and 2 method, where you fast for 2 non-consecutive days. Now, generally speaking, on those fasting days, you may have very little calories to no calories. So some people will eat, for example, 500 to 700 calories on their fasting days and then eat regularly on non-fasting days. So 5 and 2, non-consecutive, 2 days of fasting per week. Then there's time restricted feeding, which is the type that I do, where essentially you're reducing the time that you eat. So for example, you may reduce it down to a 6 to 10 hour window of eating, and the rest of the time you're fasting. And by fasting, we mean having non-caloric drinks. So of course, water would be ideal. And then of course, there's other modifications around it. So there could be something like a modified alternate day fasting and all sorts of variations. But really, alternate day, 5 and 2, and time restricted. That's your intermittent fasting. Then there's what's called a periodic fasting, which basically means you do it periodically, not regularly, but periodically. There's the prolonged water fast. Now, in some places, they do it anywhere between 3 to 21 days. But keep in mind, this is something that if you're going to do, it has to be medically supervised, especially if you're doing it longer than a few days because of the risk we're talking about. Then, of course, there's the fast mimicking diet, in which there's 4 to 7 consecutive days and done usually once per month, so to speak, followed by eating as much as you want. Now, we're going to talk about the data. We're going to see how often you should do it, what are the safety concerns, and what you need to watch out for. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. An interesting point before we dive into the data is if you look at Okinawa, Japan, what you'll find is that the traditional Okinawan diet, they really eat on average about 30% fewer calories than the average Japanese residents. And interestingly enough, they also have 35% lower rates of heart disease and cancer mortality. Now, that's a correlation, not a causation, but generally speaking, the longest living people on the planet eat fewer calories compared to the rest of the population. So let's dive into intermittent fasting. What's the research? What do you need to know? So what we know is if you look at things like intermittent fasting, you're basically reducing your calorie intake. Now that could be reduced anywhere between 20 to 40%. But what's fascinating is if you start to look at the impact on animal models. So in yeast, for example, just by restricting their calories, you have a threefold increase in lifespan. In worms, you're looking at 2 to 3-fold increase. In flies, a 2-fold increase in lifespan. In mice, you have anywhere between a 30 all the way up to a 50% increase. Monkeys, we don't really know as well. And in humans, of course, we don't have that data yet. But the bottom line here is that in addition to things like protecting against diabetes, cancer, cardiovascular disease, there is data in animal models that it helps to turn on pathways that are linked with longevity. But what's interesting about the data on longevity is it also depends on at what sort of age you end up doing it. For example, if you started in a young middle age in terms of animal models, you'll see that it's actually very helpful. On the other hand, if you have intermittent fasting being initiated at an older age, so in this particular case, they looked at it in mice models, where at 1.5 months when they initiated fasting, mice actually lived longer. But at 10 months when they did it, not only was there no difference, in some of them, there was actually a reduction in how long they lived. In human studies, when we look at intermittent fasting, what we find is even as little as 15% calorie reduction can actually improve several markers, including those that are related to diabetes, to cancer, even things like cardiovascular disease. How about looking at alternate day fasting? So looking at the results around there in this randomized controlled trial, they had 60 participants, Following them for 4 weeks, what happened? There was a calorie reduction of about 37% in the alternate day fasting, and the control group had about an 8% calorie reduction. So you have calorie reduction, but what did they find? They found that alternate day fasting had reduced fat mass, reduced methionine, which is actually a pro-aging marker, reduced SICAM, which once again is an inflammatory marker, reduced LDL cholesterol, reduce T3, increase beta hydroxybutyrate. Remember, beta hydroxybutyrate is a marker for fat oxidation. And of course, they had an increase in polyunsaturated fatty acids. So essentially, what they're finding is that there's actually lots of benefits outside of weight that occurs with intermittent fasting. And we're not sure it's just the calorie reduction. What we're finding is in addition to reducing calories, it also has to do with the fact that when you refeed the person, there's all of these mechanisms that turn on. Now, the other type of fasting, which we had mentioned, was periodic fasting. So, for example, in one form of it, you can do 4 to 7 days of fasting, and some can extend it longer, and then there's a refeeding period. But I want to caution everybody, and this is an important one. If you do periodic fasting and you do it for an extended period of time, first, it really ought to be medically supervised because there are risks. And those risks are they could be very rapid weight loss. They can also be malnourishment. They can be very low blood pressure. In fact, blood pressures drop very rapidly when people fast, and it can be used in helping people to control their blood pressures when done safely. And not to mention, there is a risk for having things like micronutrient deficiencies. And that becomes really important to make sure you're monitoring. So what about high blood pressure? Well, in this really interesting study, they had about 140 patients with high blood pressure. And high blood pressure was defined as blood pressure over 140 systolic and 90 diastolic. Now, this was done in an inpatient setting, so they have very close monitoring. And what they did was, it was really a supervised water only fasting. So they did the fasting for about 10 to 11 days. Then they allowed them to feed back up again. And what they used was a low fat vegan diet. And fascinatingly enough, the average, not the max, but the average blood pressure reduction was 37 points systolic, 13 points diastolic. Remember, this is a really drastic reduction. So you want to make sure that you're very careful about electrolyte changes. If you have any kind of heart conditions or any kind of medications you're on, you want to make sure that those medications will not have adverse impacts. So anything where you're doing periodic fasting, you definitely want to get your healthcare team involved. Then there's another type, which is the fast mimicking diet. Now, it's really fascinating what happens in this one. Basically, what you end up doing is on those days that you're doing the fast mimic diet, they may be 4 or 5 days, once a month or once every 3 months or so forth. What you'll have is a low protein, low sugar, high unsaturated fat diet. And what the data shows is when you follow this type of diet, IGF-1, remember IGF-1 or insulin-like growth factor 1, which is linked to a number of cancers and so forth, goes down, your sugars goes down, increased ketone bodies goes up. So remember, what the beauty of fasting is you can do it in a healthy, safe manner instead of doing other diets like a ketogenic diet, which may be rich in saturated fats. So in this particular case, the ketone bodies go up, which have a lot of useful functions in the body, and other things actually increase as well to help lower some of those bad things like IGF-1. So when you're doing that fast mimicking diet, you're really cutting down your calories anywhere between 10 to 50% of what you normally eat. What's fascinating here is what happens. So if you look at, for example, let's start with the liver. What happens in the liver? You'll actually find that during the fast mimicking diet, the liver shrinks. And then part of that shrinking is there are cells that are cleaning up, there are cells that are dying. And then when you do the refeeding portion, you actually have new cells that are forming. And this is called autophagy, where the body itself is trying to clean itself out. Now, in mice model, what's fascinating about fast mimicking diet is you find that there's an increase in lifespan, 11% to be exact. But more importantly, there's also a reduction in the risk of getting tumors. How much? 45% reduction. So it's fascinating that just fasting alone can have such an impact on helping our immune system sort of rev up and do the right thing in finding cancer cells and killing them. In addition, there's better motor coordination, and they also find that the immune system profile in a 20.5-month-old mice actually becomes similar to just a 4-month-old mice simply by doing some fasting. What about in humans? Well, depending on how long you're doing in this large trial that had 1,400 people, there was fasting for 5 days, 10 days, 15 days, and 20 days. And they were basically doing about 200 to 250 calories or so on their fasting days. Now, this was done over a period of 1 year, so they had different groups at different times. But what they essentially found was blood pressures went down. Of course, when you were looking at 20 days of fasting, it's very tricky, has to be controlled, but you can see a substantial reduction in blood pressure even if you were doing just 5 days of fasting. Same thing with diastolic blood pressure, same thing with weight. And of course, the longer you did the fasting, the more drastic the weight loss. But there are risks. So it's not that you can just say, if 1 day is good, I should do 5. And if 5 is good, I should do 10 days of fasting. We're going to talk about the risk in a second. And then waist circumference, same thing. The longer you did the fasting, the more you saw changes in the waist circumference. And there are tons and tons of mechanisms as to why fasting works so well. Essentially, there's a number of pathways. So we talked about things like turning down IGF-1. There's other pathways where we're turning down mTOR, which we'll talk about later in future videos about how it works. And we're increasing some of the powerhouses like the sirtuins inside the cell. So lots of mechanisms, but not to go into all of the specifics on this video, but just to understand there's lots of different ways that fasting actually works. Then as we switch over to things like regeneration, what we find in fasting is there's actually regeneration of the immune system. This is really, really cool. It's very exciting. You also see a lot of things. For example, in the brain, there's increased neurogenesis. In the muscle, you have increased muscle stem cells. In the pancreas, you have increased insulin-producing beta cells. And in the intestine, you have intestinal stem cells that are increasing. So as you do fasting, you basically slough off all of the older cells. And then when you start to do the refeeding, after the autophagy is done, you start to rebuild. So even the fasting and then the refeeding are both incredibly important. And by refeeding, remember, you don't want to just put junk back in the body. So if you've done this fasting, when you come back, you definitely want to eat a healthy diet. And the healthiest diet that we know is one that comprises majority of plants. In brain health, some of the things that are really interesting is what fasting does is it'll protect neurons and it'll improve cognitive impairment in animal models. Even just a little bit of fasting can have a tremendous amount of difference. Now, they've done studies where they've looked at these triple transgenic mice models for Alzheimer's disease. And what happens in these models is they go on to develop very similar to actual Alzheimer's disease. They get the plaques, they get the deficits in memory and cognitive function going on. But what you find is if you have these animal models, mice specifically, do fasting, they actually have less cognitive impairment. In the immune system, now here's a really interesting component. In a particular study, what they did was they were looking at 8 weeks of calorie restriction, and it was quite severe, 66%. And they were doing it either 66% calorie reduction or alternate day fasting. And what they found was that both of them actually prevented autoimmune encephalitis in mice. Now, autoimmune conditions are very difficult. We don't fully understand why the immune system turns on them. But for folks who have them, incorporating a little bit of fasting may not be a bad thing as long as it could be done safely. So what fasting does is it actually decreases the amount of circulating T cells, it decreases the inflammatory cytokines that are present there, and of course some of the chemokines. But the question is what exactly does fasting do? Not sure yet, but we do know that there's anecdotal evidence that fasting could play a role in autoimmune conditions. Let's get into cancer. Fasting, whether it's intermittent or periodic, what happens is it protects normal cells against the toxic effects of chemo, and it sensitizes cancer cells to treatment. Now, of course, it increases cancer celling by a number of mechanisms. It decreases IGF-1. Remember, IGF-1 higher levels are linked to cancer growth. It decreases insulin, decreases glucose, decreases leptin, and decreases cytokines. So essentially the concept here is that fasting can actually be more effective against cancer when you combine it with the traditional modalities like chemo, radiotherapy, kinase inhibitors, drugs, or hormone therapy. But fasting by itself can also be wonderful for keeping our immune system in check and for preventing or at least reducing the risk of a variety of cancers. In diabetes, what we know is that both fasting and calorie restriction will have similar effects. So you're looking at weight loss will be about the same, abdominal circumference will be about the same, lipids will go down, insulin sensitivity will be increased. So even though fasting may not be superior to things like calorie restriction when it comes to diabetes, don't forget there's a lot of secondary effects that are there. But as we're talking about all of the benefits of fasting, what about the negatives? Well, there's an interesting study, and this was the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, 1944, 1945. It'll never be done again. But what they did was they reduced the calorie intake to 45% less for 24 weeks in lean men. And what they ended up finding was there was low blood counts, muscle wasting, neurological deficits, memory issues, there was swelling in the legs going on, weakness, dizziness, fatigue, irritability, and even increased amounts of depression. Why should you care? Because even though fasting is touted all over the web, it's not a miracle cure. And it doesn't mean that if a little bit is good, that too much will be better. In fact, too much could actually be harmful. In another study, in this one looking at intermittent fasting, this was 34 resistance-trained men randomly assigned to time-restricted feeding or normal diets. What they found was that over the study period of about 8 weeks, there was about a 20% reduction in total testosterone. Now, even though there weren't any negative changes in their muscle strength or how much muscle they had, we still have to understand there are things that happen with long-term fasting that we still have yet to discover. So as you think about it, people who say, let me just have one meal a day and do a 4-hour window, we've talked about the data on that, how going to extremes actually has very negative effects in the long run. Even other things like with fasting, you have a risk of gallstone that nearly doubles for women who actually fast 14 hours versus those who fast over 8 hours. And so you want to understand that anytime you're trying to do something rapid, it's going to have a lot of side effects. Now let's skip that situation. What about you're doing time-restricted fasting and you're skipping breakfast? The data on breakfast has always been controversial, but in general, correlation, what it shows is that in one particular study with a cohort looking at over 6,000 people, what they showed was that there was an 87% increase in cardiovascular mortality in people who were actually going ahead and skipping breakfast. As you know, as part of self-principle, we still say, based on the data, that breakfast should be an important part of your day. So big breakfast, medium lunch, and small dinner. Other side effects to know is some people report that with fasting, their sleep can be disturbed. They can have tired or fatigue. Some people have dry mouth, back pain, hunger, bad breath, headaches, muscle pain, abdominal bloating, or even diarrhea. So as you think about fasting, remember, with everything in life, there's a sweet spot. And if you're in that sweet spot, you get the least amount of side effects and the most amount of benefits. With fasting and calorie restriction, that's exactly the same. If you go too far on the extreme, you're actually going to get a lot of negative impact. So you want to make sure that as you're going down the spectrum, to have a healthy reduction in calories. A little bit of fasting does wonders for you. If you decide to do time-restricted fasting, it's not a bad idea as long as you're not taking it to the extreme. Then the other portion of this that you want to remember, and this is probably the most important thing, is this whole weight cycling or yo-yo dieting. If you decide to do fasting and it's not right for you and you lose some weight, then you gain some weight, then you go on some kind of a crash diet, lose some weight, gain some weight, it's not just that you regain the weight. In fact, what the studies show is that your risk of mortality actually goes up. In this particular study, there were 3,600 participants. They had a 16-year follow-up going on. And what they were looking was for people who lost 7 to 10% weight, then they regained it. Then they lost it, then they regained it. And that had a 46% increased risk of mortality. In another study looking at 6,000 people with type 2 diabetes, the people who had the highest variation in body weight versus the lowest risk, they had a 59% higher risk for any heart disease event. They had an 82% higher risk for a major heart event, or 75% increased risk for a heart attack or stroke. Death was 82% higher. Heart attack was 99% higher and stroke was 92% higher. So what does that tell you? Is whatever you decide to do in life, you want to be consistent. You want to focus on habits. You want to make sure that whatever you're adopting, you can maintain for the rest of your life. And this is why, once again, anything to the extreme on any side, too little or way too much, is always going to be bad for you. So let's bring this all together and say, what is the bottom line? What can you take home from today's session and apply directly to your life? First, I think fasting has so much potential for it to be a positive impact on our lives. It allows us to enter these alternative metabolic modes that the act of fasting and then refeeding plays a huge role in lots of things like cognitive function, heart, kidneys, lungs, brain, GI tract, and all sorts of aspects that we're just scratching the surface. And don't forget, refeeding is just as important as the act of fasting. Now, even though the current data is really promising, once again, too much fasting could actually be unhealthy. And yo-yo dieting, which is losing 7 to 10% body weight, then regaining, then losing, actually has a lot of long-term detrimental effects or negative effects on your body. At the end of the day, remember, fasting is another tool in our healthy tool belt, as is a whole foods, low-fat, plant-based diet, as is sleeping more, as is moving more, as is practicing gratitude and kindness. But as you think about all of these tools, try to make it sustainable. I want to thank you guys so much for checking out this video and podcast. I would love it if you guys would go ahead and share this and support our work by commenting below, subscribing to it, liking it. And as always, let me know what topics you're interested in, and we'll be sure to bring it next time.